There is a cemetery in northeastern Wisconsin where 350 people share a single grave. No names on the marker, no individual stones, just a flat plot of earth and a monument erected 80 years after the burial by people who could not identify the dead because the dead had been burned beyond recognition. Not in a house fire, not in an industrial accident, but in something so total that sand on the ground melted into glass and iron rail ties bent like wet rope. The grave sits behind a small museum in a town most Americans have never heard of. The town is Peshtigo. The date was October 8th, 1871. That date should stop you. It does not, usually because the American memory has already assigned it. October 8th, 1871 belongs to Chicago, the fire that began in or near the O'Leary barn on DeCoven Street, which burned for 2 days, which leveled 3.5 square miles of the city, which killed roughly 300 people and left 100,000 without shelter. That fire is one of the most heavily narrated disasters in American history. It has a cow. It has a legend. It has a clear arc. Destruction, then rebirth, then skyscrapers. The story of Chicago's fire is the story America tells about itself. That catastrophe is a furnace, and what survives it is stronger. But the fire did not happen only in Chicago. On the same night, October 8th into October 9th, a separate and vastly larger fire consumed the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and at least 12 surrounding communities across a swath of land exceeding 1 million acres. Estimates of the dead range from 1,200 to 2,500. The number is not known because too many bodies were never recovered, and too many of the residents were transient lumber workers whose names appeared on no local census. In Peshtigo alone, 800 people died in a single hour. That is roughly the population of the town that morning. On the same night, the same hours, fires also tore through Holland, Michigan, destroying 2/3 of the city. Manistee, Michigan, lost much of its commercial center. Port Huron, Michigan, burned along with surrounding farms and timberland, killing at least 50. Across the Lake Michigan basin, from the Wisconsin interior to the Michigan shoreline, fires erupted nearly simultaneously in a corridor hundreds of miles wide. The National Weather Service would later reconstruct the atmospheric conditions. A months-long drought, an abnormally persistent upper-level ridge from July through September, temperatures in the 70s on October 8th, and a powerful low-pressure system over the Central Plains generating sustained southwesterly winds that turned every abandoned slash pile and smoldering stump into an accelerant. The conditions were regional. The destruction was regional. But the memory was not. It concentrated in one city, and the other places, the places where far more people actually died, receded into footnotes, local museum displays, and niche history forums. This asymmetry is not an accident, and it is not really about fire. To understand why Chicago kept the story and Peshtigo lost it, look first at what each place was before the flames. Chicago in 1871 was a city of nearly 300,000, one of the fastest-growing urban centers on the continent, a rail hub and meatpacking capital with national economic significance. Peshtigo was a company lumber town owned largely by William Ogden, a Chicago railroad magnate, with a population of around 2,000, most of them sawmill workers. Holland, Michigan, was a Dutch immigrant settlement, small and religiously tight-knit. These were not equivalent places in the American hierarchy, and the disaster did not make them equivalent. It exposed the hierarchy. Chicago had newspapers. Chicago had telegraph access. Chicago had insurance companies with headquarters in New York and London that stood to lose fortunes. The fire in Chicago became national news within hours because the infrastructure of attention was already centered there. Peshtigo had none of that. Its telegraph lines burned with everything else. Word of the disaster reached the outside world days later, and when it arrived, The newspapers were already full of Chicago, not because editors made a cynical calculation, but because the information system, like all systems, followed its own structural incentive. It reported what it could access from places where it already had correspondence about events that affected markets it already tracked. This is the first layer of the pattern. Disasters do not narrate themselves. They are narrated by the infrastructure that survives them. And that infrastructure is never neutral. It is already shaped by capital, by density, by proximity to power. A fire that kills 300 people in a major economic center will always generate more narrative than a fire that kills 2,000 people in a timber settlement, because the cost is not counted in bodies. It is counted in disrupted systems. Look at what happened next. Chicago rebuilt with astonishing speed. A local census taken the year after the fire showed the population had already grown by 30,000. By 1880, the city had passed 500,000. By 1890, it had more than doubled to over 1,000,000, making it the second largest city in the United States. The fire did not slow Chicago. It is not an exaggeration to say the fire accelerated it. And the nature of the rebuilding reveals why. Insurance companies, many of which paid out less than a third of total damages, began demanding changes in construction. The city enacted new building codes requiring brick, stone, and eventually steel. Architects flooded in. William LeBaron Jenney designed the home insurance building in 1884, completed in 1885, 10 stories, steel-framed, widely regarded as the first modern skyscraper. The Chicago School of Architecture emerged directly from the rubble. The blank slate became an advertisement. Come to Chicago, where everything is new, where the old wooden city has been replaced by something unprecedented. Investors heard that pitch. Immigrants heard it. The federal government heard it. Chicago's fire became Chicago's origin story, the founding myth of the modern American city. Peshtigo got a mass grave. The town was rebuilt, slowly, under the direction of the same William Ogden who owned the factories there. But the lumber was gone. The industry that had created Peshtigo, and that had, not incidentally, created the conditions for the fire through decades of slash-and-burn clearing, discarded timber, and reckless land use, did not return in the same form. The town survived, but it did not transform. It endured. Today, Peshtigo has a population of roughly 3,400, a fire museum, and the cemetery. It is a quiet place that bears its history the way small towns bear their histories, locally, without leverage. Holland, Michigan, rebuilt as well, retaining its Dutch character and eventually growing into a modest regional city. But it too generated no national mythology from the event. The fire in Holland was understood within that community as a trial of faith and endurance. It was not available for the larger American story because it did not serve the larger American story. It had no skyscrapers to offer, no architectural revolution, no proof that destruction was actually opportunity in disguise. Here is where the three cities, taken together, reveal something that none of them reveals alone. The same atmospheric system, the same drought, the same reckless land use practices, the same months of accumulated risk produced fire across a region spanning 2 states and dozens of communities on the same night. The cause was singular and structural. Extractive industry had stripped the landscape. A warming and drying climate pattern had primed it, and human settlement had distributed itself according to economic logic rather than ecological awareness. The disaster was not a Chicago story. It was a Great Lakes story. It was, in a meaningful sense, an industrial era story. The first large-scale demonstration that the way Americans were using land could produce consequences faster than communities could absorb them. But the narrative contracted. It became one city, one barn, one cow, and the reason is not mysterious. Narrative follows investment. The places that attract capital before a disaster attract attention after it. The places that attract attention after a disaster attract more capital. And the places that had no capital to begin with, The labor towns, the timber settlements, the immigrant farming communities absorb the same physical destruction, but receive none of the narrative return. Their dead are just as dead. Their suffering is no less total. But their stories do not compound. They do not generate architecture schools or insurance reforms or municipal reorganization. They generate a museum with limited hours and a cemetery most people drive past on the way to somewhere else. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to have decided that Peshtigo's dead mattered less. It requires only that the systems which produce public memory, media, capital markets, insurance networks, political attention, operate according to their own logic, and that logic consistently amplifies the experiences of economic centers while muting the experiences of peripheral places. The same fire on the same night under the same sky becomes a founding myth in one place and a forgotten tragedy in another. The difference is not in the fire. It is in the infrastructure of remembering. Historians do occasionally note the coincidence. Fire history texts mention Peshtigo alongside Chicago. The National Weather Service maintains a detailed page on the Great Midwest Wildfires of 1871. Some accounts point out that the Peshtigo Fire was the deadliest wildfire in American history, a title it holds to this day. This is not suppressed information. It is available to anyone who searches for it. And that is precisely the point. Availability is not the same as integration. A fact can be technically accessible and structurally invisible at the same time. Peshtigo is in the archive. It is not in the story. It does not appear in the version of 1871 that Americans absorb through schools, documentaries, and popular history. The gap between what is available and what is narratively active, that gap is where most of the actual history lives. Not hidden, just unweighted. The benign explanation is simple and partially true. Chicago was bigger, more important economically, and more telegenic. The media covered what it could reach. People remembered what was repeated. There is nothing sinister in the mechanics of attention. And yet, if the same mechanics reliably produce the same outcome, the erasure of peripheral suffering in favor of central spectacle, then the question is not whether anyone intended the distortion. The question is whether the distortion is structural, whether it happens not once, but every time. Whether the pattern of 1871 is actually the permanent grammar of how disasters are recorded, consider how this grammar has reappeared. In almost every major disaster since, the version that survives in public memory is the version attached to the largest economic center involved. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake overshadows the damage across smaller towns along the same fault line. Hurricane Katrina is remembered as a New Orleans story, though the Mississippi Gulf Coast was, in many ways, more completely destroyed. The pattern is consistent enough to be predictive. Give any regional catastrophe enough time, and the narrative will migrate toward the city with the most pre-existing infrastructure of attention. The smaller places will be available in the archive and absent from the story. This is what the three cities of 1871 teach when you hold them side by side instead of letting one eclipse the others. They teach that the most dangerous thing about a disaster is not the event itself. It is the process by which the event is converted into narrative, because that narrative determines where the rebuilding money goes, which building codes get rewritten, which architectural movements get born, and which places simply receive a grave marker and a slow fade. Reverend Peter Pernin, the Catholic priest who survived the Peshtigo Fire and left the most detailed eyewitness account, described the moment the firestorm hit the town. He wrote of a sound like a freight train, of air so hot it ignited clothing before the flames arrived, of people diving into the Peshtigo River and holding their heads underwater to breathe. He described finding a 12-year-old boy the next morning, alone, digging graves for his entire family. Those images are as vivid as anything from Chicago. They are, by any human measure, more devastating. But they did not have a telegraph to carry them east in time to catch the first news cycle. So they waited. And by the time they arrived, the slot was filled. The question worth sitting with is not why Peshtigo was forgotten. It is what the forgetting reveals about the system that produced it, and whether that system has changed in any meaningful way, or whether it is still, right now, sorting which disasters become myths and which become museums, based not on who suffered most, but on who was most visible before the suffering began. Chicago built the skyscraper. Peshtigo built the grave. Both emerged from the same wind, on the same night. The difference was never in the fire.